My name is Thomas Henderson, and for most of my life, I believed a simple creed my father taught me: finish what you start. It sounded like something you'd slap on a coffee mug, but for our family, it was a law. My father built our lake house by hand, every beam, every nail, every stone, and he used that house as a classroom. Out on that narrow dock, he taught me to cast a line without snagging the reeds. In the dim light of the living room, he taught me to sand wood with the grain. In the kitchen, he taught me that every project has a mess in the middle, and that's where you prove who you are. I'm 48 now. I own Henderson Auto Services, 7 shops scattered across Wyoming like mile markers on a road I didn't know I was paving when I started. Folks see the signs, the full bays, the trucks that come in battered and leave running smooth, and they think I must have had help. Truth is, I had a leaking roof, a used set of tools, and a truck that coughed soot like a chain smoker. I also had knuckles that split and healed so many times they stopped bothering to complain. Back then, I measured success in small things. The first customer who came back a second time. The first winter I could afford to replace the propane heater. The first mechanic I hired who stayed past closing because he cared about the job, not the clock. I told myself I wasn't just building a business. I was building a place where broken things came to be made whole. That included my life with Linda. We met in college. She had that clean, bright laugh that made you think of new paint. She studied education for a while and then said she wanted to raise a family instead. I didn't argue. I was covered in grease most nights and too tired to pretend I was a philosopher. We got married in a small church with terrible acoustics. It didn't matter. She smiled. I said, "I do," and we walked out into a world that felt ready to be built. For years, I believed we were a team. I came home late. She had the kids bathed and the kitchen orderly. I told myself that was her side of the ledger and the shops were mine. When a second location finally made sense, she hugged me and said, "You never stop." I took it as a compliment. When the third shop opened, she took a photo of me with a ribbon I didn't want to cut and said, "For the scrapbook." I took it as love. What I didn't see were the little ledgers she kept out of sight. Of late dinners, of school nights I missed, of storms she drove through alone. I'm not saying she didn't support me. I'm saying that when someone bears the quiet weight of a house, they start counting in a currency you can't see until it's too late. The first cracks showed up like hairline fractures do. You only notice them because the light hits just right. We were eating lasagna, hers, and she said, out of nowhere, "How many lifts do we own outright?" I laughed and said, "All the interesting dinner topics, and you pick hydraulic lifts?" She didn't laugh. "I want to understand," she said. "You never explain the money side." The next night, she asked about insurance coverage. A week later, cash reserves, vendor credit, depreciation schedules. She started carrying a small notebook. When I asked what she was writing, she said, "I forget things." I believed her because it was more comfortable than not. Around the same time, David Kane, my operations manager, 15 years at my side, started staying late. David was the kind of man you trust without remembering when you decided to. He'd helped me load clunky alignment machines onto trailers in February wind. He'd stood next to me at my father's funeral and said nothing, which is exactly what I needed. If you'd asked me to list the people who would never turn on me, I would have written his name in thick ink. He began asking about cash flow projections like he'd swallowed a banker. He wanted to know renewal terms on fleet contracts, our credit line covenants, the percentage of revenue coming from tire sales versus heavy work. Planning, he said with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. Trying to be a step ahead for once. I nodded. Planning is the kind of word that puts people like me at ease. Then, one night, I went back to the main office because I'd left a manila folder on the copier. It was 9:40 p.m., the kind of hour when an empty shop feels like a church, quiet, drafty, honest. David's truck was in the lot. The office lights were on. I walked in slow, not wanting to startle him, and heard his voice through the half-closed door of his office. "Yeah," he said, low and confident, like he'd already walked the path he was describing. "I've got the numbers. After the divorce, she'll have the cash. I'll bring the client lists and the vendor terms. We can undercut Henderson in every market." My hand tightened around the folder until the metal prongs bit my palm. He paused, listened, and added, almost lazily, "He won't see it coming." He trusts me. There are moments that rewrite your past in an instant. Every beer on my porch, every hunting trip, every late night scheduling session, rewritten. I stood in the hallway and felt something both heavy and hollow, like the first second after you slam the brakes and realize you aren't going to stop in time. I didn't go in. I walked back out into the night, sat in my truck, and stared at the steering like it could explain anything. When I finally drove home, the lake house was all I could see in my head. The angle of the rafters, the way the boards creaked when the wind came off the water. My father's voice, "Finish what you start," sounded like a dare. The next morning, I called Robert Lane, my attorney. Robert is not dramatic. He is precise. He listened without interrupting, then said, "Thomas, if Linda files, everything acquired during the marriage is presumptively marital property. Shops, equipment, accounts, the house, unless you can establish it's separate. The lake house, did you inherit it?" I nodded. "Good. That helps. But cash and business equity are exposed. If you want to protect what can be protected, you need to restructure before any filing, and you need to do it yesterday." He laid out the blueprint. Henderson Holdings LLC becomes the parent. Henderson Auto Services remains the operating company. Title the real property, equipment, and long-term contracts to the holding company. Move the lake house into a family trust with a bloodline clause. Keep everything above board, documented, business justified. If it smells like fraud, he said, some judges will burn the whole house down to find a match. We will not smell like fraud. I signed what felt like a forest of papers. He moved quickly, a surgeon with a calendar. "And Thomas," he added, almost as an afterthought, "you need clarity on your suspicions. If you're right, evidence will matter more than anger." He slid a business card across the table. Patricia Huso, ex-detective. Careful, expensive, worth it. Patricia had an office between a tax prep place and a sandwich shop. The carpet was clean and the blinds were straight. I trusted that more than diplomas. She listened the way professionals do, like she was measuring my sentences. 3 weeks, she said. Maybe 2 if they're sloppy. If there's an affair, I'll find it. If there's financial activity, I'll map it. If there's nothing, you'll sleep better. I didn't tell her I already knew I wouldn't. Those weeks tasted like metal. Linda's questions didn't stop. She began taking calls on a back porch, pacing slow, smiling at nothing. David became a ghost who could move parts without sound. A vendor term tweaked here, a delivery rescheduled there. Employees felt the tautness without understanding it. I watched them joke in smaller doses. One afternoon, Linda asked, "If something happened to you, what happens to the shops?" I said, "They keep running." She pressed, "On paper. What happens on paper?" I said nothing. It was easier than lying. The following Tuesday, Patricia called. "You want to come in?" she said, voice even. I have a full picture. On her desk sat a neat stack. Photos, receipts, hotel logs, screenshots of messages she'd lawfully obtained. Linda and David at a restaurant in a town we never visited together, sharing a plate, his hand brushing her wrist. A motel on a highway that serviced nobody and nothing except secrets. Credit card charges, the dates marching along beneath them. A copy of a retainer agreement with a family law firm out of state, dated 11 months prior. Notes from consultations with a forensic accountant. And then, an image that punched. Linda and David on a bench by a man-made pond behind a mall, laughing like high schoolers trying out adult clothes. Patricia summarized like a detective delivering weather. She's been preparing for a contested divorce for nearly a year. He's been providing internal business information for at least 4 months. There's evidence of intent to compete. The legal term you'll want to say slowly is breach of fiduciary duty. I drove to the lake house that evening because I needed somewhere that didn't lie. I sat on the steps with my back against the door, watching the water fold itself toward shore. When the light changed, I called Robert and said, "Do it. All of it. File the holding structure. Execute the trust. Make the operating company clean and small." And Robert, I exhaled. "When it comes, I'm not fighting her in the aisles. I'm going to let her think she won." He paused. "That's risky." So I was opening the first shop. The papers were served on a Thursday, right before lunch, while I was in a shop office arguing with a printer that refused to acknowledge paper. The process server said my name like a question, handed me an envelope, and walked out as if he'd just paid a bill. Linda's petition read like a shopping list. $7.2 million, half of Henderson Auto Services, the lake house, spousal support for a time period that made me feel older than I am. The narrative section told a sweet, slanted story about sacrifice and support. It didn't mention the motel by the highway. I brought the envelope to Robert. He scanned, marked scanned again. We stay calm. We do not tip our hand, he said. We acknowledge service. We stipulate to an expedited hearing. We accept the frame. And then we change the picture. At home, Linda moved through rooms as if they belonged to a polite stranger. She made tea with the same tin of leaves. She asked about my day as if the envelope didn't exist. I answered as if it didn't either. When she went to bed, I stood at the window and watched the yard go darker in layers. David avoided me for 2 days, then came into my office with a spreadsheet and a friendly frown. Supply costs are going to squeeze us next quarter, he said. We should stagger tire orders. I nodded and asked, how's your weekend look? He blinked too slow. Quiet, he said. Yours? I'll be at the lake, I said, and let the sentence hang like bait he refused to notice. The morning of the hearing, I put on the only suit I own that doesn't make me look like I'm attending someone else's wedding. The courthouse hallway smelled like old dust and coffee. Linda stood with her lawyer, a man whose hair and watch both announced his hourly rate. David sat in the row behind them, tie loose, jaw tight, pretending to read his phone. Robert leaned close. You are about to do something that will make them feel like gods, he said. Don't blink. I won't, I said, and meant it. Linda's lawyer went first, his voice trained to treat a judge like a colleague. He spoke of partnership, of years traded for his client's husband's ambition, of evenings alone and sacrifices made. He ladled words like equity and marital partnership and fairness. He didn't overplay it. The best of them never do. When the judge turned to me, Robert's hand brushed the table twice, a metronome reminding me of the tempo we practiced. Mr. Henderson, the judge said, do you contest your wife's proposed division? I stood. The room pivoted, a lens clicking into focus. I looked straight at Linda. No, Your Honor, I said. I agree to everything. A sound went through the gallery, like someone had dropped a wrench on concrete. Linda's shoulders unknotted. Her lawyer's pen hovered, then scribbled. David exhaled like a man tasting air after a tunnel. Robert didn't move. The judge nodded, surprised to find a road where he expected a ditch. He reviewed the proposed division, made notes, and then, as his pen lifted for the final time, I took the folder from my briefcase and said, as politely as I could, Your Honor, may I submit several documents into the record? They affect the practical execution of the court's order. Inside the folder, the stamped articles for Henderson Holdings, LLC, the assignments of contracts and equipment, the minutes of board actions, ours, properly documented, the trust instrument for the lake house with the bloodline provision, the investigator's report, factual, not florid. The judge read longer than anyone expected. Linda's eyes found mine and tried to pull me into an old world where a look meant something. David stared at the tabletop like it might split and swallow him. Linda's lawyer's mouth went dry. You could hear it in the way he cleared his throat twice without speaking. At last, the judge set the papers down and said, voice neutral, Mrs. Henderson, it appears the assets awarded are in significant part not held by the operating entity you have named, and the real property is encumbered by a trust with terms that would limit transfer. The court's order stands, but its execution will require adjustment. Mr. Henderson, do you have a practical settlement proposal? Yes, Your Honor, I said, and let the words be plain. $500,000 in cash, paid within 60 days. Each party bears their own fees. No claim to the lake house. No claim to any holding entity. We both walk away. There is a silence that feels like weather changing. The courtroom had that silence. Linda's lawyer asked for a recess he framed as brief, and the judge, who had seen too many people forget how to be human, granted it. In the corridor, Linda approached me with a face I remembered and a voice I didn't. How could you, she asked. I almost said, how could you? But I have learned that mirrors do not persuade. We are where we put ourselves, I said instead. We can leave differently. David hovered, then chose the bravery of distance. Robert murmured into my ear, "Do not negotiate with ghosts." I nodded. They came back in less than half an hour. The lawyer's voice was smaller. "My client accepts," he said. The judge recorded the terms, set deadlines, and closed the file with a soft thud that sounded like mercy. 3 days later, we executed the buyout of David's minority interest at book value. On paper, it was $30,000. On the street, it was a sentence. Word moves fast in industries that depend on trust. Vendors are gossips with invoices. Technicians are historians with torque wrenches. By month's end, David had gone to a town 2 states over where people didn't know the sound of his name. He took a job managing a single-bay shop behind a gas station. I did not enjoy the news. I also did not mourn it. Linda tried to contest the trust through a new lawyer who said things like sham and intent, but paper is stronger than adjectives when it's clean. After 6 months of fees that hurt more than they helped, she dismissed the petition and moved to Denver. She texted me once a year later to ask if the kids wanted to visit the house by the lake one last time. I told her it wasn't a museum. What remained was not triumph. It was work. Work to steady the shops after months of quiet sabotage. Work to look each employee in the eye and say, "We are fine," and mean it. Work to forgive my own blindness without pretending it had been sight. Contracts don't sign themselves because you survived a courtroom. Trucks don't fix themselves because you told the truth. The fleet contract that changed our year came in late fall, a statewide maintenance deal that required discipline and gave stability. We won it not because I outlawyered anyone, but because our estimates were honest and our shops ran on time. I hired 2 new managers, both of whom understood that competence beats charm over the long road. I took fewer victory photos and more inventory counts. At the lake house, I replaced 3 boards on the dock that had started to rot from the underside. Good boards to a casual glance, soft where it mattered. I sanded the rail where my father's hand had worn it smooth, then left the worn place as it was. Some patina is a kind of memory you're not meant to refresh. One evening, my nephew brought his kids. The older one asked if he could hammer something because Grandpa did. I let him drive a nail into a scrap beam and told him to listen for the change in the sound when the head seated. He missed twice, then found a rhythm, and looked up like he'd unlocked a secret that would last his whole life. Maybe he had. When I sit on the porch and the water shivers in the wind, I think about the difference between revenge and resilience. Revenge imagines a crowd. Resilience imagines a morning. Revenge wants someone to watch. Resilience wants you to stand. I didn't win because I surprised a courtroom with a folder. I won because I learned to protect what I could, repair what I couldn't, and keep showing up where the work is. The winter after the divorce was the quietest of my life. The shops were busy, the books balanced, the contracts steady, but the silence at home was its own kind of sound. I had grown used to a house where footsteps moved in parallel to mine, where voices layered over each other, where even an argument meant you weren't alone. Now, the kitchen ticked with the clock, and the living room hummed with the refrigerator down the hall. I thought about filling the silence with television, but it felt dishonest. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table with a yellow pad and wrote lists. Not of parts or orders, but of things I'd ignored. Repairs at the lake house, letters to friends I hadn't answered, habits I had dropped because they didn't fit the schedule I once called survival. It turned out survival without love can feel as heavy as failure. One of the first weekends, I drove to the lake house alone. The air smelled like cedar and old snow. I lit a fire in the stone hearth my father had laid, sat in his chair, and listened to the wood pop and shift. Memories arrived like uninvited guests. My father humming while measuring a plank, my mother handing him lemonade, Linda smiling on the porch during our first summer there, the kids running barefoot across the dock. I realized then that betrayal doesn't erase the past. It stains it, but it can't burn it. The good moments are still real, even if the people who live them with you changed. I spent the next months restoring the house piece by piece. I replaced shingles, patched siding, repainted the trim. Work with what feels different than work with steel. Steel resists, wood listens. If you cut wrong, it shows. If you sand with the grain, it forgives. Every hour at the house steadied me in ways no courtroom could. Back at the shops, I made changes too. I shifted more responsibility to Tony, a foreman who had been with me nearly 20 years. He wasn't slick, but he was steady, and steadiness was the one quality I craved. I promoted a younger manager named Claire, sharp and honest, who asked questions because she wanted answers, not leverage. For the first time in a long time, I stopped seeing shadows in every question. The betrayal still echoed. Employees whispered, vendors speculated, customers asked gentle questions. I answered simply. We had differences. We're moving on. Over time, the whispers softened. The work spoke louder. Engines started, invoices cleared, wheels rolled. Spring arrived. My nephew brought his kids again. The older boy asked if he could try fishing from the dock. He stood there, tongue between his teeth, waiting for the bobber to move. When it did, his eyes went wide. He hauled up a wriggling trout, and for a second I saw myself, years earlier when my father had stood behind me saying, "Steady, steady, now lift." I cleaned the fish, cooked it in butter, and told the boy, "That's the taste of this place. Remember it." One evening, after a long day at the shop, I sat on the porch as the sun dipped low. The water turned to copper, the trees to shadows. I thought about Linda and David, where they might be, what stories they were telling themselves. I didn't feel anger anymore, just distance. They had chosen their path. I had chosen mine. People sometimes ask me if I regret agreeing in court, if I wish I had fought harder or shouted louder. The truth is, I don't. The best move wasn't to fight, it was to prepare, to protect what mattered before the storm hit. That's something my father would have understood. Revenge? That fades. Resilience? That lasts. Revenge needs an audience. Resilience only needs a sunrise. Today, Henderson Auto is stronger than ever. The shops run with less drama and more discipline. The lake house stands firmer than it has in decades. My kids visit, my nephew's kids laugh, and every creak of the boards reminds me of the man who taught me to finish what I start. Betrayal didn't destroy me. It refined me. It stripped away illusions and left me with what was real. And what's real is enough. So when I look back at that courtroom, at Linda's smile fading, at David staring at the floor, I don't see triumph. I see a man who almost lost everything, who walked through fire and came out still holding the only things worth holding. And when the dust settled, I was still standing. That's victory. Not the kind that needs applause, but the kind that lets you breathe free air and say, "I'm still here." And this will endure.